Okay, this video is going to be to explain the fuel hoses on a two-stroke jet ski. So any two-stroke jet ski that's carbureted is going to use some version of this. So if you understand these principles, you can troubleshoot if you're having an issue starting your ski, or even any sort of fuel issues. So it's important to know how this works. A lot of people will tell you, hey, go rebuild the carburetor OEM carb kit. Well, if you're going to spend the money on a carburetor kit, you should, number one, understand how your fuel hoses are set up, how the fuel system works. But you should also check your fuel pickup tubes, because some of them can be pretty rotten. These ones are all rusted off. So you want, on the Kawasaki's, there's often these filters that are down on the pickup tube. So there's different versions, you know. This one's missing the screen. There's a little screen on the bottom, I guess. So Yamaha sometimes have a hose and a filter that sits down in the tank. So you're gonna have one that's a longer pickup tube. That's the reserve. You're gonna have one that's shorter. And if you look at the top, a lot of this stuff is labeled. There's on, there's reserve. There's an arrow pointing in, so that's the return line. This one on the top is going to be a vent. So you're going to have a one-way check valve, and it's going to have an arrow that points to the tank. You want to check that, take it off, and make sure that you can blow in. So there's a one-way check valve. You want air to go in as you're using up fuel, as the engine's burning fuel. You don't want to create a vacuum in the tank. You also don't want the air to just vent. You don't want gas fumes venting into your engine bay, because you could have a spark and an explosion. And a lot of times this hose will be routed in a way, on the stand-up skis, sometimes it goes up into the pole so that it's trying to pull in air that's not pulling in water. So from your pickups, now these are labeled, and also on a lot of them, if you look, the hose is actually labeled. So this longer one, that's your reserve pickup tube. It goes to your selector. It says RES is for reserve. On, that's the shorter one. So you're going to have a dial on the side of your ski, and you're going to have reserve, on, and off. So set it to on normally, and as you're out there riding, if your ski dies on you, you set it on reserve, and that's to let you know you're low on gas to get back to your loading dock. The earlier skis didn't really have fuel gauges, so that's kind of how that fuel gauge works. So the return line, gonna follow that. If you're taking these off, you can go to Harbor Freight. If you're unfamiliar with the hoses, you can get some zip ties. So I put red for return. So over on the carburetor, the highest fitting is the return line. Also, if you look really close, there's an R on there. So as the engine's pumping, it's going to be pushing fuel back through the return line. This is the green. I put green for on. So that's coming from your fuel selector. So after you selected reserve or on, that's coming into your carburetor. So that's your source of fuel. Now this white zip tie, there's a fitting on the side of your engine, the crankcase fitting. This is called the pulse. There's a tiny little symbol on there. That's your pulse fitting. So that's what runs the fuel pump. There's a diaphragm inside of here, and that's what pumps your fuel. If you happen to have a Sea-Doo and it has gray and it says tempo, you really want to replace those lines, because those lines get gummed up with ethanol fuel and it clogs up your carburetor. So if you're having problems, especially you just got a ski or you just rebuilt the carburetor or something, it's not one to start, what I like to do, pull off the return hose, pull off the line in, and you blow into this. That's going to pressurize your tank, and it's going to push fuel up here. Now if you have it selected, whichever one you have selected, as long as it's not selected at off, you're going to have fuel come out that hose. Now if you're premix, you can serve a dual function. You could dribble that gas, if it's premix, into the carburetor. So now you know you have gas coming in here, you know you have gas going into the top of the carburetor, you leave the return line off and you crank your ski, you should see fuel coming out. If you crank the ski over with this return line off, you should see fuel coming out that return fitting. So that lets you know that the fuel pump is working. Then you also know that you cleared out the lines and you have fuel that's getting to the carburetor. Now if your selector is clogged, or any of these hoses are clogged, you can kind of pull off those hoses and blow into the return and see where your clog is. Another thing you could do is you could cap off the return line and just run one hose from the reserve, the longer pickup. You could just run a hose from the return into the on. That way you bypass the selector, you bypass the hoses. Now if you do that, you want to cap off the hose that you're not using. Normally you want to use the return, but for testing it out, you can run a hose from the return pickup directly into the carburetor. That way you only need 3 hoses for your engine to run. You need the pulse line. Now normally the pulse line, you want it as short as possible, and you don't want a soft hose that can collapse, because that's what's running your fuel pump. So if you want to test it out, you want to simplify the system, just run one hose from your pickup, cap off the other pickup, run it directly into the on, and then test it that way and see if one of your hoses has a leak or is clogged or something like that. Another thing, when I pull the return off, I'll blow into it and then I'll put my thumb. You're looking for any sort of a leak. If you let go on your thumb and it still has pressure, then you know you don't have a leak. So also, if you're new to 2-stroke jet skis, you need to find out if your ski, some of them have an oil pump. So there's an oil tank, there's a hose, there's going to be a bigger hose that goes into the pump, and then there's going to be a smaller hose that goes into either the intake, or sometimes there's a fitting on the carburetor, and that pumps in the oil. So if you're going to keep the oil injection system, you need to make sure you have oil, you need to make sure there's no leaks, you need to make sure you have a good hose, and these smaller ones can get brittle over time, so you might want to replace it. You can get Tygon oil fuel hoses and replace them. On some skis there's a check valve, there's a little plastic one-way check valve, so you need to keep track of that. I think Yamahas and some Sea-Doos have a little check valve. There'll be an arrow on there, so you want to keep track of those and put them back on the same way. If you want to get rid of it and pre-mix, so you get a mix can, and it tells you, you know, if you want to run 40 to 1 and you want to put 5 gallons, then you fill it up with oil, and then you put this in 5 gallons of gas, and then pour that into your gas tank if you're pre-mixing. So it's important with the 2-stroke to know what system is set up. If it's not pre-mixing, if it's still oil injected, you really need to take a look at these oil lines, make sure they're good. If you're going to get rid of the oil pump, you can get a little block off plate, you pull this off, pull the studs out, and you bolt it on there. Anytime you go to premix, you need to make sure that this is capped off. You don't want an air leak on this oil line that feeds into the carburetor. So some people put a cap on here, or you could drill this out, put some epoxy or JB weld on it. So that should explain somebody that's having problems with their fuel hoses. Get some zip ties, and if you look close on a lot of the skis, the hoses are labeled. There's labels on the carburetor, there's labels on the selector. Now sometimes these are tucked up in a hard to read spot. There's labels, there's arrows, a lot of the stuff is labeled. So this is a good thing to check, especially if you picked up a ski that's been sitting around for a while. Check and make sure your fuel pickups are good, your hoses are good. You don't want to be fighting tuning issues when really it's an issue with the fuel hoses, or your pickup tubes. If your pickup tubes look like this, or even if they have a little crack in there and it's pulling air, once the fuel gets down below a certain level, it's pulling air, that can be a problem with your fuel. So one other thing is check your fuel cap. Make sure you got a good soft rubber gasket, because you don't want water getting into the gas. So that's another thing to check that can give you problems with tuning your ski, getting it to run good. Those are some things to look at on the fuel side.